think the idea that Putin is threatened by this a potential paragon of democracy on his border, having tossed out 2 Russian-facing leaders in revolutions in the last 20 years. I think his interest in using his leverage, which potentially is at its peak right now, we shouldn't underestimate these more self-interested, cold, calculating motives for war.
I'm curious, Christopher. The title of the book is Why We Fight, but at the core of the book, it's mainly why we don't fight. You make the point, don't you, that most of the time wars don't happen. What did you want to approach it from that angle?
Well, I mean, I think it's useful to listen, imagine a doctor who only ever saw sick people and didn't know that the normal state of humankind was health. Not only would that person be incredibly depressed and demoralized, which is a problem, but probably they make really bad diagnoses and never actually figure out the right treatment. And so I think the starting point is just recognizing that, our normal state of political health is not to be at war.
Okay. You make it, clear, very clear that war is a bad idea. And it's also incredibly costly on many levels as well. And talk to us about these number of factors. So 5 key ingredients that lead nations to override that and to go to war.
Right. So if people are going to remember just one thing, it's that war's ruinous. And so every reason for why we fight is a reason that our society or our leaders ignore those costs or overlook them. And the book is about how, well, there's a reason for every war and a war for every reason, of course, but actually these reasons also basically fit into sort of 5 different logics. And just let me use maybe what's going on right now as an example. So one logic is really intuitive. It's the idea that if our leaders are unchecked or unaccountable to the people, then they're not going to consider most of the costs. They'll just consider the costs to them, which is a small fraction. And so they'll be too ready to use violence. And if they see it in their political interest to go to war, well, they'll be too quick to use it. So that first one is sort of these unchecked interests. The second is the idea that some of our leaders, and Vladimir Putin's an obvious example of this as a personalized ruler. The second I think of as ideological or other kind of intangible incentives. And we hear these stories all the time about Vladimir Putin, the idea that he's either pursuing personal glory or he's pursuing some national vision of a greater Russia. So so there's a cost that a lot of the cost he doesn't bear, but he's willing to pay those costs for this ethereal gain. So those are the intangibles. The third thing we hear a lot about are his misperceptions, right? The idea that he's isolated, misinformed, overconfident, underestimating the costs, right? So yet again, another story about how someone like Putin is underestimating or not thinking about these costs of war. And then the last 2 are a little more subtle and strategic, and people tend to forget them, but they're really crucially important. One's just the uncertainty of the situation. The fact that the costs weren't known, all these things were uncertain. Ukraine's pluckiness and resolve, and Ukraine, the Russian army's own effectiveness. And so it's not so much that you misperceive systematically your bias, but it's just you have to make a guess, and war becomes a gamble about what those costs are. And then finally, there's something that we call a commitment problem, which is basically the idea that your adversary sometimes can't commit to a deal. And in this case, Ukraine was acquiring weapons, was moving closer to democracy. It was in Putin's private interest to try to exterminate this, and it was obvious there was no way Ukraine could commit not to do these things. And so in some sense Russia was at its maximum leverage, and so it was willing to pay those costs simply because it foresaw itself getting weaker steadily over time to lock in its advantage. So that's kind of the way I think we should look at all these conflicts.
Are you going to tell me that you predicted that Vladimir Putin would go to war, would incite war on a nation?
So absolutely not. And I'll be quite honest, every Russia expert and war expert I know is kind of done with giving predictions because
it did genuinely surprise a lot of people, didn't it?
But here's the thing, the war is so ruinous, and we're seeing this right now, right? We're just seeing how costly this is. And Ukraine can't afford to keep this up for very long. It's costing half their economy every month. And it's the same for Russia. So, the best prediction, listen, it's not the right prediction all the time. The best prediction is always that we're going to that there's not going to be violence because it's so costly. But of course, I didn't write a book called Why We Don't Fight. I wrote a book called Why We Fight, because sadly, it does sometimes happen.
We've asked lots of experts here on Times Radio, and we were told in the early days of war that actually no one had taken time to try and understand what was going on with Vladimir Putin, that no one took time to ask even about his intentions. How important do you think that is? Or in the case of Vladimir Putin, would that just have been irrelevant? Is that a personality? Is that a person for whom you couldn't do any balances and checks against?
Right. Well, I think the fundamental problem, and to me, the fundamental source of conflict throughout human history, throughout the world today, is unchecked power. Not just because it leads a leader like Putin to not consider all the costs or pursue their private interest, but because it makes us more susceptible to their ideologies. It makes us more susceptible to their misperceptions. It's impossible for dictators to make the kind of credible commitments that would actually lead to a settlement. And so in these personalized regimes, which frankly there's not much we can do about, I think it is important to know the minds of these dictators. And unfortunately, that's the hardest thing to do, because personalized rulers are just constantly threatened with coups and are paranoid for very good reason, not because they're crazy, but because that's actually how you stay in power. And so it's been very difficult for anyone to know, I think, what's in his mind, despite what you read, where everyone seems so confident. I don't think anybody really knows.
And just briefly, just before the war in Ukraine, you wrote a short piece asking the question of why diplomacy didn't work. Have you got any closer to understanding that in the case of Ukraine and Russia?
So, I think, time will tell, because we don't know what's gone on inside the mind of Putin. I guess if I had to guess, I agree. It almost seems like the verdict's in, that everyone seems so confident that this was Putin pursuing personal glory and glory for Russia and his isolation. I'm sure that's true, but the problem we have as human beings is we so often overestimate these psychological costs. We tend to demonize our adversaries, and then we kind of misestimate them ourselves, which is not what we want to do. So I do try to point to these more strategic logics, at the role of uncertainty, at just how much of a gamble this was. Just nobody expected Russia to get a bad draw on all of its gambles, right? I'm glad they did, but nobody expected it. And I think the idea that Putin is threatened by this a potential paragon of democracy on his border, having tossed out 2 Russian-facing leaders in revolutions in the last 20 years. I think his interest in using his leverage, which potentially is at its peak right now, we shouldn't underestimate these more self-interested, cold, calculating motives for war.